All right, we're back here with Letters and Sounds in Spanish Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1 already, go back and check that out. Part 1, we went through the first 17 letters, or the first 17 letters that we wanted to go through in the alphabet. And those were the letters in Spanish, which really, as an English speaker, you can more or less just read as they appear to you with very little thought as to how you need to pronounce them. Part 2, we're going to go through the remaining 10 letters, but these are letters that you're going to have to pay a little bit more attention to because they're not pronounced the way that you would expect in English. Most of them are pretty easy. It's just you're going to have to think about it and be ready to pronounce them a little bit differently. So as a reminder, here is the Spanish alphabet. Seen most of these letters already, pretty familiar, except for that one N with a little squiggle on top of it, which we'll talk about today. All right, the first letters that we're going to talk about are easy enough letters. These are letters that are different from the way you'll pronounce them in English, but they're sounds that you're used to. And so with that, I'll just kind of mention that the H is a sound not at all like in English, where we say the ha. In Spanish, you just do not pronounce anything. There is no H sound in Spanish. It's really there. You can see like in hoy, whether the H was there or not, it would be pronounced the same way. In almohada, there's a little kind of space in the middle, and you'll hear that when Alejandro pronounces those. So go ahead.
La letra H. Hoy. Hoy. Almohada. Almohada.
So very simple, just don't pronounce it. You'll want to, as an English speaker especially, pronounce that H, but just learn to more or less ignore it. And also remember that the sound, or that the name of the letter is a little different, H rather than H. The next one is Jota. It can be a little difficult. You can pronounce the ha a little bit more deep in the throat than in English, but honestly, if you pronounce it more or less like an English H, you're pretty much on the way to saying it just right. So if you can kind of mentally replace those J's or the Jotas whenever you're reading in Spanish with an H sound, you'll be well on your way. And with that, take it away, Alejandro.
La letra J. Jirafa. Jirafa. Manejar. Manejar.
The next one is the letter B. And this is very confusing for a lot of people who are learning Spanish because you expect the V to be pronounced like a V in English, when in reality in Spanish, the letter that we would call B, be, and the letter that we would call V, which is also pronounced be, are really pronounced the same. And so go ahead, Alejandro. And it's just something that you need to think about pronouncing that not as a vaca, but as vaca.
La letra B. Vaca. Vaca. Convivencia. Convivencia.
The next letter we're going to go through is Q, like Q in English, but it's Q in Spanish, and that's really the big difference that you need to pay attention to. We're used to QU being a Q sound, like almost like a KW sound. In Spanish, there is no W. It's just K. It's just almost imagine that U is not there. It's just a K sound with no W. So it's K, queso. Go ahead, Alejandro.
La letra Q. ¿Qué? ¿Qué? Queso. Queso. Key. Key.
So all these letters, pretty straightforward, but there are habits that you're going to have to break to remember you're not pronouncing this the way you would if it were an English word. You're pronouncing it the way that these letters are pronounced in Spanish. The next few sounds are actually all pretty easy because they're sounds that you recognize, but there are many letters in Spanish that you can use to represent the S sound. In English, we use the S. Sometimes in English, the S can be pronounced Z in certain words. In Spanish, S is always S. It's always smooth. There's another Z in it. And the letter that we would call Z in Spanish, zeta, is also pronounced S without any Z to it. So there's no Z in Spanish. It's always that smooth S sound. So go ahead with zeta.
La letra Z, zapatos. Zapatos. Abrazo. Abrazo. Maíz. Maíz.
So the next letter that we'll talk about, and the other way that you can get that S sound in Spanish is with what we would call C in English, but it's C in Spanish. So the letter C, when it's followed by the vowel E or the vowel E, so what looks like the letter I or E for English speakers, in those two examples you see there, the C will be pronounced just like an S in English. So go ahead, Alejandro, and then we'll talk about the next ones.
La letra C, ciudad. Ciudad. Parecer. Parecer.
Now, one thing that is a little tricky about the letter C is that it is pronounced differently depending on what vowel follows it. So you can look down if it's followed by a, an o, or a u, it will be pronounced hard, k, like a K sound. So we have examples of all those there. Go ahead, Alejandro.
Cuna. Cuna. Recoger. Recoger. Azteca. Azteca.
So that C being pronounced in two ways, fairly familiar. It works that way often in English as well, but in Spanish it's a very hard and fast rule. You look at the C, what vowel is following it, and you'll pronounce it accordingly. There's one more letter that can create the S sound, which is the X in English, or the X in Spanish. Go ahead, Alejandro. And I will say quickly, this is fairly rare, and it's only going to be found like this in the beginning of a few words.
La letra X, xenón. Xenón. Xenofobia. Xenofobia.
So X actually is a letter that we have dedicated an entire slide to because it's probably the letter in Spanish that has the most variety in the way it can be pronounced. It's not that difficult. There isn't that much real difficulty in pronouncing it, but I wanted to go through the different examples here. So when you see X in the middle of a word, it's pronounced pretty much the way you expect it is going to be. And in most of these cases, these are words that were taken from other languages. So even from an English speaker, you're going to recognize a lot of these words and pronounce them in a way that's going to make sense to you. So it has the X, like the KS sound, just like in English. So go ahead for those middle of the word examples, Alejandro.
Examen. Examen. Taxi. Taxi.
The next couple of words where X starts the word sounds just like an S, and we went through those examples before. And the other two uses of X are really a little bit more localized in Latin America, especially in in Mexico or Mexico, especially in Mexico or in Guatemala. And these are mostly words of indigenous origin, or in the Mexican case, where we have the Mexican X. Sometimes in Mexican Spanish, they will use an X where otherwise you would use a jota. And this is just a way that they do it in Mexico that they're proud of. They don't want to change it. They know they do it a little differently. But it does mean that words like Mexico, and actually it's not Texas, it's Tejas in Mexican Spanish, are pronounced a little bit differently. So go ahead and go through the Mexican X examples, Alejandro.
Jalapa. Jalapa. México. México. Texas. Texas.
So that's something you really only run into with Mexican Spanish, but because in the United States, Mexican Spanish is pretty common, I think it's worth mentioning. The last example that you'll see of X is in certain indigenous names, and I don't know enough about the history to know whether it's Aztec or Toltec, whatever people, but for certain indigenous names, they will use the X to represent the sh sound, because it's not a sound that typically exists in Spanish, but they'll use the X to represent that sound in some place names which were pre-Hispanic. So these were the names of the places before Spanish came. When the Spaniards were trying to write down the names of these places, they threw an X in there, but the pronunciation is more sh. So go ahead, Alejandro.
Xela, Guatemala. Xela, Guatemala. Punta Chicalango, México. Punta Chicalango, México.
Sí, te estoy enseñando el español.
¿Sabes más que yo?
No.
Es por eso que sí, ok.
¿Cómo?
Continúa.
No. ¿Qué dijiste?
No, que cuando un estudiante, por ejemplo, tú estudias español y sabes más que un nativo en español porque
No es que sé más, pero
aprendes.
otras cosas.
Es.
Sí. All right. So similar to the way that we talked about se having a couple of sounds, where it could be either si, or k, se or k, la letra g also has a few sounds that it can have, and they're fairly similar to English, but you do have to pay attention to the vowel that's following it to know how it's pronounced. So with that, go ahead, Alejandro. The first two are pretty straightforward. Gente, it's ge, kind of like a jota. G, more like an English, when followed by a or u. And the third one is w. It's kind of like a GW sound, antigüedad, and it's really only followed by that U that has the couple little dots above it. So with that, take it away.
La letra G, gente. Gente. Agitar. Agitar. Golosina. Golosina. Canguro. Canguro. Güey. Güey. Antigüedad. Antigüedad. Cigüeña. Cigüeña.
All right, and we've saved the best for last. So here we have the one new letter that you will be learning as you learn Spanish, the ñ, which really isn't that difficult of a sound for people who speak English, it already exists in words like lasagna. It's really an NY sound. But it is important to make sure you're not just pronouncing it like an N sound, that you put in that Nya. One example that I learned as a new Spanish student is the difference between año, year, and ano, which is anus, because I once told someone that my brother had 13 anuses when I was trying to tell him that he was 13 years old. So very important. Sometimes the meaning can be very different based on whether it's a ña or a n sound.
La letra ñ, ñato, ñato. Baño, baño. La letra R, pero, pero. Cara, cara.
So ere is the only real new sound that you have to learn as a native English speaker to be able to communicate in Spanish. Ere and then erre, which we'll get to in the next episode. So the only thing that I will say, there's a lot of videos you can find out about how to pronounce ere. It can be really difficult. Some people feel like if you didn't learn it as a kid, you can't do it. But what I will say is that actually we have a sound very similar in English. We just don't really realize it. Because when you see that, what looks like an R, you want to pronounce the R. Really, that's a very English speaking sound or very American sound. And it's pero or cara is not going to be understood by someone unless they've been around a lot of American speakers and have figured out our bad accents. So pero, cara, it's much closer to what we would say in English if we were saying the name Eddie or Betty quickly. Say Eddie, Betty. We're not saying Betty or Eddie. We're saying Eddie, Betty. Just pay attention to what your mouth is doing when you say Eddie, Betty. You're throwing your tongue up, kind of touching the ridge right there behind your teeth. Eddie, Betty. That's the sound that you want to make when you're trying to say the Spanish R. Think of it almost like a D. Pero, cara, cara. You're much closer, even if you just throw in a quick D sound, than trying to say pero or cara. And we'll throw it out, say pero, and work on that a little bit. Pero, cara, cara, cara. Listen to native speakers, play with your tongue, kind of bouncing up like that. It's different, but it's not that different, and it's not something that you can't learn. And work on it. It's not something you can skip either if you want to be a good Spanish speaker. There is a difference between an R by itself, pero, and when there's two R's together, which would be perro, and that's important, but we'll save that for the next episode. So for this, now you've seen all of the letters, you've heard all the sounds in Spanish. We're going to next go through some letter combinations, a little bit about accents, and then just wrap up everything you need to know about pronouncing Spanish words. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.